Bizarre Brain Comics. Mm-hmm. Hello, Gary here for Bizarre Brain Comics. This is where we kind of like to look at some older comics, talk a little bit about the creators, the characters, the story, and the art. And this time, I have something I want to kind of pose a question, which is inspired by a story in this book right here. This is Marvel Comics Fear number 6 from 1971. Yes, 1971. And we're going to take a little look at the story. The Midnight Monster. Midnight Monster. Midnight Monster. That's a cool title, though. And this is a reprint story. Unfortunately, it doesn't give the date or where it was originally reprinted from. But I would guess that it's probably the very late 50s or very early 60s. It has a nice cover illustration by Gil Kane, who did a lot. Now, this book was, for the first mini issues, was primarily a reprint title. In which they reprinted a lot of stories from various earlier titles dealing with horror, their monsters, the giant monsters, and some of the spooky science fiction stuff. And the story is kind of a Jekyll and Hyde type story, the Midnight Monster. Take a look in here. There isn't much information. Marvel Comics Fear, number 6. This was a giant-sized issue, yeah. And it was the title was published from 1970 to 75. It's a horror title, primarily reprinting primarily reprint. I misread that. Okay, and later the title changed to Adventures into Fear, and these later issues featured the Man-Thing, and then moved on to Morbius, the Living Vampire. But prior to that, it was all reprint stuff. That's some of the big old monsters and whatever spooky things. And the art is the Midnight Monster. The art is by Jack Kirby, with inking by Dick Ayers. No credits, so I don't know who wrote it, but given the time, I would guess it was, at least the script was probably done by Stan Lee, and I wouldn't be a bit surprised if the plot was provided by Jack Kirby without credit. So it was reprinted probably from the late 50s, and it is a Jekyll and Hyde story. And the question I have to ask is, could this possibly be a proto-Hulk story? Could some of the elements in here be inspiration for the Incredible Hulk? And we'll see why. And I'll talk a little bit when I'm down there. When I'm there, it's all. So, let's go take a little look in the pages of Marvel Comics Fear number 6. Okay, and here you can see, get a better look at that cover drawn by Gil Kane. He did a lot of covers because he was such a good draftsman and very dynamic. It was really eye-catching. Could pull you in, and I wonder if maybe they kind of you mostly see the backside of this creature, which is the lead story in the book, so that you can't confuse it with something else. Now, as I have said, okay, I am a big fan of the Marvel monster comics. I have several of them in various conditions. You can see this is a little bit rough, but very good for reading, which is mostly what I have here. The Monster Masterworks, reprinting several of some of the key monster comics from the 50s and early 60s. And I really, really like those. And most of those in there I have or have had in standard comic form. Now, of course, at this time, when it was still Alice, just before it became Marvel Comics, they were known largely for their giant monster comics. Of course, they had some teen humor and some westerns and other stuff, but that's what they were really known for. And they only had just a very few titles that they could do to get distributed. So when they started doing superhero stuff, intentionally or not, they made it look more like, the first few issues look more like their monster comics. Case in point, the Fantastic Four. Okay, the four of them went into space, exposed to gamma rays, came back to Earth, and they had the powers. And then Ben Grimm is, as the Thing. He is basically a holdover from the monsters, and their first menace that the Fantastic Four faced in the comics was the Mole Man, in which he attacked New York City with a bunch of giant monsters. And so they're that famous and iconic cover with the Fantastic Four fighting these giant monsters coming up out of a pit in the middle of New York. And of course, the Hulk, they have the monsters, and he is basically a monster, especially initially. And even Spider-Man, even though in the story he's definitely not a monster, but you see in that very first issue of that's what was it? Amazing Fantasy 16? Am I remember that correctly? Someone can remind me. That had the very first issue. Even though the interior art was drawn by Steve Ditko, the cover was drawn by Jack Kirby. And in that image, Spider-Man was presented as if he were a monster. And then even in Thor, even though of course Thor is not a monster, the first part recounted how Dr. Don Blake acquired the power of Thor. But then the very first menace he faced was right there handy, this handy dandy little invasion from outer space. And the creatures, the aliens, were these larger than human, but not quite gigantic, orange rock-like beings that bore a strong resemblance to Ben Grimm the Thing. And of course, Thor cleaned their clocks and sent them back to their home planet. And of course, many years later, they made other other appearances, including in the movie Thor Ragnarok. One of his friends from the arena was one of those alien orange rock-like creatures. Okay, now the reason we'll want to get into this, show the story, and then we'll see why I think this is a proto-Hulk story. Okay, fear. Run, all of you, run for your lives! Nothing can stop the Midnight Monster. Midnight Monster. Okay, and you see on the splash panel. And, looks kind of familiar in a way. And it's Jack Kirby art. He, and the style of his art really reflects his work from the 50s. So that's one of the reasons why I think it was the 50s or very early 60s, before his style matured a bit and he got more bulkier and his figures got bulkier and had a more heroic look. So then the story begins. Here's this scientist in his lab, and they never do give this fellow a name. So he's handsome and he's a playboy and he's rich, and my serum works, and he's been working on something, and he's tested it on this rose. Here these ladies all going all gaga over him right there in his lab while he's trying to work, and they come in and they try to sweep him away because they want him to go partying with him. And that's the kind of stuff he knows. But this he's known for. But these this serum made the rose gigantic and morphed it into something almost horrendous and made it virtually immortal. And here, so then he was ready for it. While the ladies are still there, he takes the test a little farther. He tests it on an animal. Here's this kitty cat. Pours him in the cat's bowl. It drinks it, and it morphs into this really vicious and monstrous-looking saber-toothed type cat. And you can just see the huge bulking muscles rippling under that cat's hide. Don't know what he ever does with the cat, but then later, he, as he often does, he's with the ladies, goes to a party surrounded by all these ladies, but he spots this one young lady who just trips his hammer, and he goes on and gets to know her a little bit, and we don't ever find out her name either. Well, they're dancing, and he is just totally smitten with her, and he wants her for himself, and he's used to getting what he wants because he's not a very good fella. And even though later, it's, like I said, it's a Jekyll and Hyde story, he's not a very good person to begin with, and he gets worse. But some weeks later, the young lady has latched on to a former boyfriend of hers who had been away, by the name of Bill Cooper. I think he is the only named character in this story, and they're going to be getting married. And so this rich scientist, he is not happy about that. He doesn't like being thwarted. He says, "What? You prefer a penniless engineer to me?" Makes me think of Sheldon Cooper, who always denigrated his friend for being merely an engineer, while everyone else had doctorates in some of the sciences. That's some foreshadowing there. But I love Bill. Please try to understand. I'll get my revenge. And he discovers that, well, that's later. And he storms out of there. And then a few days later, he's in his lab and he's just ranting and raving. Standard Kirby type art. This is 3-tier, but what's unusual is this is for him. This is a 9-panel page layout. But here he is, and he's got his serum, whatever it is. It says he wants to test it on a human, but who could get anyone to volunteer, even though they'd become incredibly powerful and virtually immortal, how could they, but in the process, become a horrifying monster? Who would do that? Who would volunteer for that? Well, I will, just so I can get what I want. And he drinks his formula. And then we see him transform. He's getting bigger, bulkier, and kind of losing his hair. And he turns gray. Big, hulking, and gray. Yes, there he is, a monster. Now, for those who may not, this is where I kind of get kind of a proto-Hulk, especially for those who may not, who might be younger, or may not be aware, that the Hulk, when he first appeared, in his first couple of adventures, he looked a lot like this. He was big, bulky, and gray. Incredibly powerful, but he was gray. And the gray didn't print very well, so then they changed it to green. And even in some of the reprints of that original story, they made him green. But for the most part, it's acknowledged that he was gray. And he transformed into the Hulk at night, every night. And then when the sun come up, he would turn back into Bruce Banner. Well, this guy never turns back, but he gets even more vicious and more vile. He sees how horrible he is, and he's saying, yes, I can go get my revenge on Bill Cooper, and then I can find an antidote for my for the serum so that I can change back. Maybe I can go back and forth at will. And you can see a big hulking figure, and he climbs up the building to the apartment where Bill Cooper lived. He creeps into the bedroom and grabs the guy and, you're not Bill Cooper. Where is he? Oh, he got married this morning. They took a job someplace out west at a lab somewhere out west. What? Of course, there's still quite a bit of difference in the facial features, but he looks a lot like the early Gray Hulk, even still having the suit on his body, although it's torn. And he's powerful. He smashes right through the wall, and as he's going through the city, just smashing stuff, and bullets don't even faze him. And he's trying to track down where this Bill Cooper is. And the farther he goes, people see him. And he gets the moniker of the Midnight Monster because he stays hidden during the day, but he can move about pretty freely at night. But people still see him. And there he is. They're trying to hunt him down. And he's just so powerful. He just rips this tree up. He just rips this tree up and tosses it at these people, this posse. And they don't stand a chance against him. Finally, the army is called in. And again, the machine gun bullets just have no effect. And he's just tearing this tank to shreds. And the army just don't know what they can do. What on earth they can do to stop this monster. And then he finds out where there's a challenge issued to him over the television. He happens to be outside peeking in somebody's window. And you can see just how large he is compared to a normal-sized person there. And he's been challenged to... they have this power ray who will... and they're challenging him because see if he can best the power ray. So he steals this Jeep and he drives out to the location that they specify. And he says, "So that is your ray machine? Fools! Whatever the machine does, however powerful it is, I shall survive it. And when I've defeated you, I shall return to my original mission. I shall have my revenge. Revenge on the couple who dared thwart me." And the ground, what is it? It's all kind of muddy and it's kind of slushy. And what? Oh, the ground gives way under his incredible weight. And he falls and falls and falls down this incredible tunnel and says, "I'm falling, you fools. This won't stop me. It can't kill me. I am immortal. There's the soldiers there. Around there, and they said, "Well, that worked." And even if it doesn't kill him, I mean, that's awfully way too far. It can take him months or years to manage to crawl out of that pit. By then, maybe we can have a real ray that can affect him instead of just this dummy, this fake Ray. And then they said, soldier comes up to this guy here and says, "Not many men could have engineered the world's deepest hole in so short a time. You are a fine technician, son." And the lady says, "My husband's the best." Yes, 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 it is Bill Cooper and the girl who married him that the crazy scientists had wanted. And he was thwarted. Well, he is a doctor and all this other stuff. He was thwarted by a mere engineer, and they don't even know who he was. And that's the end. And I thought that was kind of a funny ending. So you can kind of see here how it kind of presages the Hulk. Old J. Jaws Greenskin himself, except when he was gray. Remember, for a time, I think it was in the 80s, might have been the early 90s, he was gray again, had more of his intelligence intact, and he was known as Mr. Fix-It. Now, it seems to me that like this story combined with the origin from this story, which is a monster story, which is called Craw. He's some monster. And in this, a man was accidentally exposed to an atomic bomb test, and it mutated him and turned him into this giant orange monster. And I always liked this story, and I always thought that's kind of like the Hulk. Now you combine these two together, and it is very, very combine that together. You got the origin of one, and the other, and it's very much like the Hulk. It is basically, of course, over time the Hulk got more powerful. And the Hulk was probably always more powerful than this character. But, because remember, the Hulk was not originally intended to actually be a superhero. It was just a monster story that was ongoing. And, I think, some of those things, superhero stuff, came out of the monster stories, as I already described, the Fantastic Four, etc. But there were a couple other giant monster stories, namely, probably best known, the funny name Fin Fang Foom, that Chinese dragon. Now they had, back in the 50s with the giant monster stories, they had 2 stories of Fin Fang Foom. And then, years later, he cropped up again to be a villain of, I think it was Iron Man, if I remember correctly. And that has been a recurring character. Sometimes a joke, sometimes a real menace. And another one was the Colossus, the giant monster story. And they had 2, maybe 3 stories of the Colossus. Not one right after the other, but as one being a sequel to the other. And then in the early 70s, they brought him back and made him a hero. It was only for a few issues, I think. And in those pages, the Colossus fought Fin Fang Foom. And they've had references, even in like the Fantastic Four, had under John Byrne, had a reference and a flashback scene to a pre-Fantastic Four incident with Reed Richards and Sue Storm having an encounter with a giant monster and him defeating it. It was right out of just as the same kind of stories that they had for these giant monster stories in the 50s and early 60s. So that's what I got. It ran longer than I intended, but that's a fun story. And I think it's fun to contemplate. Was this their inspiration for the Hulk? Who knows? They're both dead. Stan Lee would never acknowledge it if it were. Jack Kirby may not even remember it if he were still alive. So, that's all I got. I hope you like, share, subscribe. Share it with your other monster friends. comic book friends. And remember, comics are art.